Hi, everyone. This is For the Love of Comics, and I'm extremely thrilled and excited to be joined today by Terrence from the fantastic YouTube comics channel ComicKkrakK. Terrence, welcome to the channel.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate it. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you. It's been a while since we've chatted. We've been on a couple of live streams and on your channel and other channels before, but this is the first time it's just the two of us, and obviously the first time on this channel.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be great. I love that you're starting to do some of these conversations. The one that I watched with Earl Grey was fantastic, so I'm looking forward to it.
Well, it's great that you mentioned that because you did get name checked by Earl Grey himself as the inspiration and the instigator for his channel existing. And you're definitely one of those deep influences on me as well. So you've been doing this for a long time, where I feel like Johnny come lately in comparison. And Earl Grey
Yeah, right.
himself talked about it in some detail, but you've been doing YouTube and talking about comics on YouTube for how long now?
For like 12 years or so. I think I just had my 12-year anniversary the other day, but it's because it was sometime September 12 years ago. So yeah,
Well, congratulations. And
thank you very much.
as you know, as was observed in that earlier conversation, you do have at times an Iranian film type of approach. You've got a dashboard cam and you're talking into that. You're out and about. It's not just sitting inside the house. You've got this whole experience sort of being narrated and vlogged. And I think that's what separates, or that's what identifies your channel for me. It is a vlog about comics. And before we get started on whatever we're talking about, which we have a loose agenda for, I'd love to know, and I'd love for you to share with my viewers your sort of the instigation, or how did you get started, or why did you get started talking about comic books on YouTube 12 years ago?
So I've come from the world of like message boards and things like that. So I've always been heavy into music and movies, but music specifically, there was always some message boards that I would go to visit on various websites, whether that was for experimental music and noise music or heavy metal or whatever, right? So that experience of kind of being on those message boards and just having very loose conversations with people, a bunch of different topics, getting turned on to records. I had taken a break from comics in the 90s, like the mid to late 90s. It wasn't a very long break because then early 2000, probably 2000, 2001, I started getting back into it when we lived in Ontario. Eventually, it was kind of the same drive of what's going on with comics online. And I don't remember exactly how I stumbled onto comic book YouTube. I don't remember if it was a recommendation or if I was specifically looking for something, but I discovered a guy who's not doing videos anymore called Ghost Critic, and I discovered Sleepy Reader and Travis Oddfellow's Thoughts. Those were probably the three that were the first ones that I saw. And I quickly kind of discovered that through those few channels, reading the comments and things, there was other people on YouTube doing comic videos. There wasn't a lot of them, but there was a few of them. So I started kind of dipping my toes in, and I was immediately taken with kind of how great it was. It was this extension of the message boards, because at that time there was no live streaming. So everybody was kind of making a video. Some were editing it, some weren't. It was kind of talking to the camera and just putting that up there. But it really was this, for me, an extension of that message board kind of era where you could kind of dip your toes into a bunch of different topics. And another thing that it really had in common with those message boards is sometimes there would be like a little community conversation where they would talk about a specific book, whether it was a new book or an old book. A bunch of people went out doing videos and kind of collaborating sort of on a specific topic. One of the early topics I remember contributing to was kind of like your top favorite covers of all time, top 10. So there was those kinds of things happening that helped kind of bring us together a little bit. So I knew pretty much right away that I wanted to do something. I wasn't sure what. And like you said, those early videos, I did kind of have a bit of, I was all over the place with what I was shooting because I didn't really have a set idea of what I wanted to do. I know that I kind of wanted to talk about the books. The setting sort of mattered. It sort of didn't. I played around with editing early on. I edited like quite a lot of stuff where I would look at a specific comic and add either some music of mine or music of other people that was kind of out there within the experimental scene, and show a comic or focus on a creator. So it was kind of all over the place. And yeah, Earl Grey had said the same thing. Like, there was videos I did where it was in my car. The camera was set up in the car and I was driving to wherever I was going. I think one of the videos was announcing that my wife was pregnant with my daughter Lillian, who's now turning 11. It's kind of never been one specific mode for me until StreamYard and live streaming kind of came to. I realized pretty quick how tired I was of editing. And I just really I liked the instantaneous. I loved that there was people that could watch and comment as I was live. I really liked that interaction, because one of the things that was a big drive for all of us, I think, early on, was that comment section where you could talk to people and speak back and forth. Once that live setting came in, that kind of, it didn't get rid of the commenting. There was still a lot of comments, but I really, really enjoyed that. It was pretty focused on new comics, though. The conversation was kind of what you had read this week. So there wasn't much conversation about back issues or things like that. It was what's come out in the shops. What are you guys reading? What do you think of the story so far? And everybody would kind of take a turn and you'd have this discussion, and it was great. And that kind of really skyrocketed once that hit and that streaming technology got better and better. It was a no-brainer to just kind of sit in front of StreamYard, hit record, and start talking to the camera.
You've touched upon a number of things that I think I want to dive into. First, like, what is it about video that, as opposed to, you can blog and you can write things in prose, and message boards kind of have that prose, but with that exchange. What to you was the addition of video and audio to that conversation sort of thing as a tool that you gravitated towards or that appealed to you?
I mean, number one is I'm not a writer, honestly. Like, I have done some writing, but it's not my strongest suit. I find that the flow of things when it's live and showing off things and reacting in real time, I find is more, for me, it's a more legitimate. I find sometimes when I sit and write, and it's a purely just a me thing in my own head, I start getting into it to such a degree where I'm analyzing it, I think, too much. So I like that live where I can sort of just speak off the cuff, drop an F-bomb or two here and there, and then also react to the chat. If there's somebody that says something in the chat that leads us down another path, I'm happy to explore that. So it just that setting appeals to me a lot more than the writing side of it. I do like the writing. I've done some writing for Canon Fanzine, but I much prefer the conversational format of doing a video or doing a live stream.
And I think the other interesting thing you mentioned is you started off with editing and making videos by assembling these cuts, and have sort of moved in recent or not so recent times to being much more live stream and much more spontaneous, but no cuts and no edits. And as someone who's sort of going about it the other way around, where I find that no edits thing to be, there's no safety net and there's no way to stop yourself from looking like an idiot. And that self-consciousness is like, because I sometimes feel that the more I ramble and the less I cut, the more I lose viewers. And so therefore that cutting is almost a way of holding people's attention. So being in a live stream mode and being in a non-cutting, non-editing safety net area, does that make a difference to the kind of audience you gather, to the nature of the conversation?
I think so. I mean, because I do I always have the intention of keeping like the Sunday wraps to a shorter time, but inevitably I just end up rambling, like you said. And I'm sure there's been multiple times where I've come across as an absolute idiot because I haven't been able to edit stuff out of there. But I don't know, I still like it. So I guess, just to back up one step, the big thing with my channel is I've marked my channel since day one as adults only. And when I post videos, I always post no kids. So I'm in a very different kind of niche when it comes to kind of the YouTube algorithm or whatever, because if if I didn't have those things checkmarked, I don't think 50% of the stuff I talk about or show would pass the test. I think my channel would have been shut down years ago. And I know some people who have traveled similar veins have had their channels shut down. So I feel like that's allowed me to do things very differently, where I don't have to. It's not that I don't want to consider the audience. Of course I do. I absolutely do, because it is a two-way street, but I don't consider it that much. And as far as like editing stuff, I really liked it when I was doing it. I was enjoying it, but I just found it just became so much work for me, and having a full-time job and having a family where I still wanted to contribute to kind of the YouTube comics world, but the editing was just taking so long, and I don't have the best technology. I don't have the fanciest laptop. I don't have the fanciest setup. So it was taking even more time to do videos, because I was trying to find some free editing software that didn't have a giant name written across it. You know, maybe it was just burned into the corner or something, right? So I think those limitations kind of stopped me from ever pursuing it that much more,
Right.
which is why that live stream thing appealed. But that rambling, that kind of free flow, I think, is just really what appeals to me. When I'm watching stuff on YouTube, I can watch whatever. I watch really highly edited stuff, and then I watch a lot of like live streams. I delve into some politics stuff, for example, on YouTube. And there's live streams that are like 2 hours long, so I'll sit and watch some of that, right, or have it in the background. So I think there's pros and cons with both. Like your video the other day where you were talking, that Memento Mori video, I thought was fantastic, and there was edits in it. It looked incredible. The topic was amazing. You spoke about it really well. Like, so I can absolutely see the appeal in that kind of stuff, and it does appeal to me. Just not necessarily for me to produce myself. I just kind of want to sit down, and I think you said it early on at the beginning. It's sort of more like a vlog than anything.
Right.
It's a log of the stuff that I'm reading. It's conversations. It's highlighting kind of creators that I don't think get a lot of attention on some of these platforms, which is a huge, that itself is a huge drive for me. Spotlighting creators that don't really get talked about as much, or if at all, right? So yeah, I think that's kind of tackled your question there to some degree.
Yeah, and I love that idea of you do whatever it takes in order to achieve the thing you want to achieve. You know, for some people it might be through that editing, and for some people it might be through moving away from the things that create that friction and create that barrier. But I do also think that you need a certain skill, and you, sir, are very capable when you're on live and when you're talking, and even if you make a mistake, it's you recover from it professionally, or you acknowledge it in a way that sounds entertaining and keeps people engaged. Whereas I'm always worried that what I'm going to do is freeze like a deer in the headlights and go for about 15 minutes, you know, and that's not as entertaining. So I think somewhere a certain personality and ability to deliver and carry things out also helps in the format. This brings me to the kind of broad conversation topic that we had for ourselves today. The thing that I think about when I think about your channel, this vlog and this log of the weekly pull list of what have I read recently. And I think it's also evolved to the point where there are a mixture in your videos of new books that are new now, and other books that are new reads but might be from some time, and then other things that you're revisiting and coming back to. And one of the most appealing things to me about this is people talking about the experience of being a reader. So the topic that we've sort of broadly chosen is this notion of independent comics, the role, the presence, the importance, the significance of independent comics. But of course, I would like to go back to just starting with definitions and to this idea of independent. And because you were talking about your channel and you mentioned, well, I sort of want to do what I want to do. That's a good start right there of an idea of an independent vision. So let's start with this. What makes an independent comic? What do we mean when we say independent comic in the way that when we talk about an independent channel or independent movie? Or can we not connect those things? Is an independent movie completely different from an independent comic? What are your thoughts, or what are the definitions you use to say independent?
I mean, I think that's an intriguing place to start right there. I think that that idea of an independent movie versus an independent comic, even in an independent movie, there is multiple hands creating that movie. When it comes to an independent comic, it can literally be one person that is writing, drawing, inking, coloring, if they choose to, printing, everything. It can actually be just one individual's vision put down in a piece of art as a story, or an art book, or whatever you want to call it, and put out there into the world. The only other one I can think that's kind of closest to that is music. You know, you still have that ability as a musician, especially these days with the technology the way that it is you can record an entire album in your house, in your basement, just by yourself. You know,
Yeah.
you could for a long time, but I think it's even easier now. So when I say independent, I mean anything that's not kind of the big three, I guess. You know, the DC, Marvel, Image is a very, very, very broad blanket for independent. But to get more specific, when I talk about it, I think of like small press. I think of self-publishing. It's almost like genres of music. There's heavy metal, and then there's a bunch of micro genres within it. So independent is sort of like the blanket term, and then within that, self-publishing, small press, and then even things like I don't know, Fantagraphics, I guess at one time especially could be considered independent, you know. So
Yeah.
and even in that though, Fantagraphics is huge when you put it in that umbrella, right?
Because it's all about the relative scale. For me, I wanted to start with like as basic an idea, because when I talk to people, I think it's exactly this, especially when talking about comics, is Marvel and DC, and anything that is not Marvel and DC is independent. So there are,
Right.
it's like comics means these two companies, but it's interesting because you put Image Comics in there. And I think at one point of time, people would have considered Image Comics to be independent, and maybe people still do. But the question becomes, is Image Comics independent? Is Dark Horse Comics independent? Is IDW independent, or Boom? What are the parameters by which we classify something as independent, and when does something move from one to the other, from being independent to being non-independent? I wanted to find something that was a little bit more than just Marvel and DC, because I want to know what makes Marvel and DC not independent, if one is to look at that. And if we take it out of the American context, does that then mean that independent comics and non-independent comics can only exist in the United States, where you have Marvel and DC? And what happens if you're in a place that doesn't have Marvel and DC?
That's a good point. Yeah.
So do you have any thoughts on how you would take that Marvel and DC and Image, and why those three? Is it because of size? Is it because of revenue? Is it because of number of titles?
I mean, I always end up throwing Image in there just because I don't know if I've really ever fully thought it out. But I'd say that one of the main things that would delineate like mainstream versus independent is the attachment to a bigger corporation. So Marvel and DC being attached to a bigger corporation. There's advertising within their comics. I think that that's a big thing that delineates the kind of mainstream versus independent. I mean, I can absolutely see the argument of Image and Dark Horse and all these other places also being kind of in the wheelhouse of mainstream for sure. And I think that's also when it gets into a battle of words for me, whereas I see mainstream as stuff that everybody has access to. Everybody can go down to a comic shop and pick up something from those companies, generally speaking, obviously. And again, it's a good reminder from you of, I'm always speaking from the North American side, Canadian specifically.
Sure.
So it's a good reminder that it's not the same everywhere.
But I think you'd be surprised, because I think, I didn't mean to imply that's what you were doing, because I hear that in India and in Asia and everywhere else as well, is independent is anything that's not Marvel and DC. So it's the American companies, but the vocabulary definitely seems to be used everywhere.
That totally makes sense to me. But it is good sometimes to keep in my mind, because like we were talking about before we started recording, just audiences and where people are watching from. Even happens on my channel to some degree as well too. You get more of an international audience, so it's good to kind of keep those things in mind. So I think that something that really for me shows an independent spirit is you can't just go down to your comic shop and pick it up off the shelf. You may have to special order it. You may have to go straight to the creator or that independent publisher and order directly from them. You know, Floating World and Silver Sprocket would be two that of the bigger names of the small independent publishers, right? You can go directly to them and have them ship you the comics that they're releasing. Or you can ask your comic shop, depending on what kind of comic shops you have, they may be able to get those in for you. So I think that's another very broad way to put it for me. If you see it on the shelves, in my mind, that's a little more mainstream. If you can't just go to your comic shop on a Wednesday and pick up the newest Caroline Cash comic, that's something that's a little more independent.
I'm 100% in agreement with you on the ownership thing, because that's really as basic as I've been able to make it. I would say that an independent publisher, and this is just where I've gotten to in my formulation, because I love the word wars, they go to war in my head against each other. So I think if you are a publisher that is owned by another entity, so I'm taking a purely legal corporate structure type of approach to it almost. If you're owned by something, a company, an entity, whatever it is, that also owns other things, then you're not independent. That means you're part of something. You're part of a, I don't know, company, holding company. You're one of the assets. You're one of the many things that a larger company holds. So if you are a publisher and you are owned by an entity that also owns television channels or a movie studio or, I don't know, high fashion brand, then you're part of something else. But if you are a publisher who only publishes and all of its ownership, no matter what the size, is about that publishing business, and that's where the ownership begins and ends, that's what I would consider independent. Now, of course, we do have publishers that are owned by larger companies that own other publishers, and they only own publishers. So now that's where I run into this block where I'm like, well, they're not doing anything else, but they are doing other publishers. So the one adjustment I make over there is an independent publisher, because we're talking about publishers here. An independent comic is something that comes from an independent publisher. An independent publisher could just be one person doing self-publishing. But what defines the independence is that the publishing unit or the publishing entity is not owned by a larger entity that owns other things. Now, the next thing that I want to think about is this question of mainstream, because I think people, again, this is language that I've heard where people say mainstream titles versus independent titles. And I mean, that's fine as far as regular usage adjectives are concerned. But now if I'm taking this definition, it's like mainstream does not actually, is my thinking, does not actually stand opposed to independent, because mainstream is about popularity and sales. And so mainstream is just like, if everyone's talking about it, then it's mainstream. If your grandma knows about it, then it has reached mainstream, because that's about awareness. So something that is funded independently or produced independently can still achieve fame or notoriety or conversation critical mass and become mainstream because of its popularity. And say the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which were, it's a bastion of independent comics publishing, and at one point of time was humongously successful, outselling many superhero titles. And there might have been an oddball little superhero title being published that nobody read, but that's not independent because that's being published by DC. And this is independent because it's Eastman and Laird just doing Eastman and Laird. But this is way more mainstream than that is, because no one's heard of this superhero and everyone's heard of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Do you think that's okay, or do you see a flaw in that construction?
No, I would totally agree with you. That's a very good way to put it. Absolutely. Like the importance of delineating between mainstream content or mainstream characters or comics versus independent publishers. I think you're spot on like you said, if your grandma has heard of it, my friend, that is now mainstream. If it's kind of reaching that level of knowledge, then you are mainstream, my friend. Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that.
So, do you think that the term independent, when used in publishing, should be linked to budget or how much money you're spending, as in the amount?
Yeah.
Should that be one of the parameters? Like, if you spend more than $1 million making one issue of one comic, are you still allowed to call it independent?
I would say no, because my first question would be like, where are you getting that $1 million? I
Okay.
guarantee you haven't saved that up in your sock drawer from work in construction. You're
Right.
you're very much have some sort of backing, and I think it does apply to some of the YouTube channels too. When we think of independent creators, I would also say that sidestepping to YouTube, people that are getting sent stuff from publishers to Spotlight on a very regular basis, they may be a one-person operation, but
Mm-hmm.
even that for me stops them from being sort of an independent creator, because they're
Ah,
getting backed to some degree by these publishers, because the publishers, rightfully so and understandably so, recognize there's an audience. If we send this individual some books, they're going to talk about it, which means our books get in front of an audience, which is
right.
going to be great for us. So, but I would say that some of those people that are receiving that kind of stop being independent, because they're now being backed again, going back to the idea of the big two being backed by a corporation and having a lot
Hmm.
of tentacles in other areas. That is one thing that would maybe take you out of that.
Interesting. So you would take the money even further than just the simple legal construction of a corporation. You would say that if you're being funded or backed by something, but then what if my friends gave me money? What if I did crowdfunding, or what if I inherited
Right.
money from relatives? What if a whole bunch
Yeah.
of people got together and put their savings together? You're still creating cash, you're still creating like a corpus to pay for stuff. What if someone put $1 million together by asking, hundreds of thousands of people for $5 each or something like that? Is there something then as true independence without having any support, without having any help, without having any contributory factors?
There's a couple answers to that. I think the number one is yes, absolutely. Because some of the comics that I read from people to this day, like brand new stuff, I'm actually communicating with a guy right now through email, trying to get some of his comics that he does all himself. But I think
Hmm.
that it still exists today. As far as the crowdfunding thing goes, I think that's where some of these definitions start to morph depending on the
Hmm.
time, right? So I think the other thing for me personally is, when I think independent, because I'm really steeped in kind of 80s comics and like the small publishers then, and underground comics, part of my definition lives in that era. Whereas
Right.
now I think that you can still be an independent creator and use these platforms to your advantage. I think that, like with music, the tools that are available to independent publishers or self-publishers, maybe let's say, are just more vast, where we're at a point now, and I would say that we've been at this point for quite a long time, where you don't need any corporation. You don't
Right.
need any big funder. You can do all that stuff. Like you're saying, crowdfunding is an excellent example of a tool that's made it that much easier for, if I wanted to do a comic, I put it out there and I can get money. And if I'm lucky, I get some mainstream status and get $1 million contributed. So now the comic that I'm making can be a graphic novel. Plus, I can do this. Plus, I can do that. It gives you the ability to have some more economic freedom within your artistic vision, right? And that's the thing that I love about kind of more modern art and comics and music, that there's just so many tools available where people can very, very clearly say to corporations, go screw yourself. I don't want anything to do with you. I can do this myself, which for me is a huge key with independence and the importance of the do it yourself ethos and kind of culture that surrounds it all, and the importance of that. Because I think it is enormously important to have very strong independent voices that aren't attached to someone else. Because even going to the example again of the YouTube videos, I'm not saying this is true for everybody, but I would guess that in general there may be some channels that receive gifts of comics or graphic novels or omnibuy and they don't want to do a negative review about it. So it's sort of getting that gift then sort of puts the blinders on and you present things in a different way. Whereas again, with independent, I'm free to say what I want, when I want, how I want, within reason, obviously, because I'm still prone to getting my wrist slapped if it will happen. But that freedom, I think, is huge to the conversation too. I think I sort of got you and then rambled a little there, but yeah.
No. It's all about the ramble.
Right.
I think that corporate ownership, and by corporate, again, we can mean different things, but it's a simple enough thing of, is this the only thing you do, or do you do, other things as well? And if you do other things as well, you can keep them separate, but they are going to bleed over at times, and it's going to be inevitable that you're short somewhere else and you take from here, you need something else, or you double down on that. That's the whole point of owning many things, so that you can redistribute things according to efficiency. So for me, independent really means this and only this, primarily and exclusively. And that can now range in size. And I completely agree with you that times change, and what avenues are available in the technological, as well as the financial, keep evolving. So that's why I think it's such a tough term to come to terms with, because it means something different in every context. And what you think about as independent, with your you've got this interior knowledge. When you talk about independent creators, you may be talking about people who are creating their own zines and stapling their zines together and mailing it out to people going to festivals and selling it face to face. And to somebody else who's saying Saga is an independent comic, it's like oceans apart. But yes, I think at a fundamental level, that corporate ownership and that question of vested interest is an interesting thing.
I also think that something we haven't necessarily touched on explicitly is the idea that with independence comes a freedom to say and talk about whatever you want. So within the structure of like a Marvel or DC, you may have some fantastic transgressive ideas that you want to insert into a comic, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of checks and balances that are either going to encourage you to explore that or stop you from exploring those ideas, right? Like there's a lot more hands in it as far as, again, getting this story out that is from you and something that you really think about, whatever it is, whether it's an autobiographical thing, something that's going on in the world like Joe Sacco's Palestine and things like that. When there's hands involved in getting your expression and your creativity, that also stops you from being independent. So I think that's a huge part of the equation for me. If I have an idea, I can put it on a paper, I can photocopy it, and I can staple it and hand it out there. Nobody's going to stop me. The only thing that's going to stop me is, are people interested enough to buy it or not? That's a whole other conversation, right? But I think important part of this whole structure.
Absolutely. I think also you touched upon that earlier when you said independent spirit. And that's something I wanted to get to, because we're still dealing with this like on that finance corporate level of what is independent. But of course, independent behavior, independent vision, independent creative approach is a different kind of thing. I mean, there's some intersection and there might be some overlap, but they don't necessarily have to be the same, I would think, because I think of an example in which I see someone create a comic in their living room. They're stapling it together and they've made it exactly a facsimile of the Marvel comics that they read. It might be technologically and financially independent, but I may find it limited in its vision, or it's because all you're doing is regurgitating the formula and the thing that you've seen before. Now, I'm not making fun of this imaginary person. I just mean that I think you and I wouldn't apply an independent vision as a descriptor to that thing that they're creating because it's derivative and because it's shallow. So we're passing judgment.
Interesting. I don't know if I 100% agree with you on that, because there's some creators. I wish I would have pulled it. There's an artist, David Enos, who I love. He did a mini comic called Batman is a Lost in the Woods, and it is a Batman bootleg Or there's
Mhm.
Mehdi, I can't remember Mehdi's last name. He did a couple of Spider-Man bootlegs. So it's paying homage to a genre that they love, the superhero genre. They are twisting it beyond belief for
Right.
sure, but it is still something that they're creating because they have a genuine affinity for that, but they're still putting their twist. So I don't know if that would exclude you from being independent. It would depend on, I guess, the subject matter and how you're presenting it, I guess,
Yeah, I
maybe.
would say in that case, the twisting is what I would classify as the independent spirit that
Right.
makes the thing independent. I'm talking about something theoretical that doesn't have that twisting. It doesn't have that commentary, or it doesn't have that thing of homage. It's essentially replication. It's essentially
Right.
formula. It's the kind of formula based things that we give corporations grief for, but individuals are equally capable of doing that. And that's a different way of looking at independent, where what we're talking about is, where does that peculiar voice come from? That peculiar voice isn't going to come from that big corporate thing usually, because
Mhm.
there are too many things to watch out for. And you touched
Mhm.
upon, I think, briefly, ads as well. And that's something that I've heard people say, is that anyone who works with advertising is not independent because they're
Mhm.
beholden to their advertisers. There are, I think, independent publishers that we would know who do run ads in their newspapers or their magazines and zines. So what's your thoughts on that? Is that a hard line for you, that if you have advertising, you're not independent? Or do you find there to be some gray area or wiggle room?
Yeah, it's definitely not a hard line because I would agree with you that in my mind, it's how beholden are you to those advertisers?
Right.
If those advertisers called you up and said, "Hey, that last issue you put out, it had some X, Y, and Z that we don't agree with. Next time, don't have that anymore," and you listen to those advertisers and then altered, then
Hmm.
that's a whole other. Then you are not independent for sure. But if an advertiser calls you up and says, "Hey, I don't like X, Y, Z," and you tell them to go hit the bricks, I don't care. You don't have control over what I say. If you don't want to advertise, that's fine. I don't need your money. That would still be a thing. But I do recognize that,
Right.
again, going back to like this due dissidence that I watch on YouTube, they do some advertising, but in no way does their advertising affect their political content. They talk what they want to talk about. They have advertising as a way to generate revenue so they can not have to have a full time job and they can do that full time, and
Mm.
that is a huge interesting conversation, that because I do feel like there's a lot of people that if you see an advertisement, if you sniff out an advertisement, that's it. Not only are you not independent, I'm not listening to you anymore. Your views aren't your own, yada, yada, yada. I mean, Bubbles fanzine and Strangers fanzine, I think both of those have advertising in them. And I think they charge for that advertising. Now, it's from a very specific group, people that are independently publishing books, small comic shops and things like that. But those are still advertisers. I still would say that those are independent publications, because of the content and because, again, they're not the advertisers. As far as I understand it, the advertisers aren't dictating what it is that they talk about, or what they can and can't talk about.
Do you think then that means that at some point of time, it does come down to trust, where you just say, I trust you, don't have this money and that decision influence each other somewhere, even if it's unspoken? There's always that pressure. Say YouTube, since we were talking about YouTube, if YouTube is my full time job, if I want to earn money from YouTube, I'll have to start thinking about what's going to earn me money on YouTube. So I
Mhm.
would change my content or evolve my content to get more of whatever I think is going to make me earn more money. So why that distinction between my optimization of what my content should be? Your point is that, well, if it's yours, but it's not being dictated by somebody else. Do we take it on trust and face value then? If someone says, this does not affect my decision, we say, well, it doesn't affect their decision. If I suspect that it does, then I'm not going to watch them anymore. Somewhere does it come down to that trust, because it's so nebulous otherwise of what interest and self interest is and what the intersections are?
I think it does come down to trust, but I also think it comes down to the individual watching the YouTube channel, to use that example. I mean, I think personally, I'd be able to sniff it out. You know, I'd watch somebody's videos and then you could see a turn of like every time they talk about a DC book, they're talking about it in a very specific way. I think that there's the ability with individuals to sniff that out. And it also leads into a thought process for me as far as like art versus commerce. And I always have felt. So I played music my entire life in various bands and things and solo stuff and all sorts of things. And I work in film here in Winnipeg. And there's always this idea of artistry versus commerce. And I find a lot of the time that artists aren't allowed to make money. And I just find that idea so fucking stupid, if I can curse. You know, I really reject that idea to a pretty strong degree. So I think there's also this conversation that should be had about there's nothing wrong with creating art that then you want to try to make a living off of. Does that make it any less art? I personally don't think so. But again, it really comes down to the individual and what they're presenting and what that says to you, how it speaks to you as a viewer or a consumer or whatever it is. Not to put you on the spot, but I mean, you have a Patreon. So do you feel that everything you create from this moment on has to please the Patreons? I personally don't see that from you, the bit that I know you. I do also, though, see wanting to engage with those Patreons so they feel that there's a little bit of give and take. And I think that's kind of a little bit more of a business mind versus doing some creative stuff. And I think so far from what I've seen from your stuff is the balance of that is held really well. There's an engagement with the audience. Of course, you want to keep your audience engaged. But then there's things that you want to talk about yourself. So then you talk about things that you want to talk about. So I think that the balance can be struck and kind of do something that's maybe a little more artistic, if we want to use that blanket word, but still sort of understand that there's an audience out there that is participating in this and the importance of that. I think with some art, I totally get the fundamental, you need to create art for yourself. I get that absolutely. And I absolutely agree with it. But I don't think that doesn't make you an artist once you start considering your audience, even if it's just a little bit. Now, again, it's a degree thing. If all I'm doing is creating stuff that the audience loves, that's a different thing. There's still artistry in it, but I wouldn't necessarily say that you're an artist if 100% of what you create is solely based on what your audience wants, you know? So it's where it becomes a very nuanced and difficult conversation to sort of pin down with some of those things.
I think that's the nuance that fascinates me, because I do completely agree with you on this idea. I don't know why it's propagated, but this idea that artist means starving artist, or
and
that
suffering.
if you are, you have to suffer for your art, and how dare you think about putting a value on what you do. This notion of either business and money is everything, and that's the way of the world, or it's absolute evil. It's that sort of absolute ends of the spectrum nonsense that I find to be not at all constructive. So when I think about independent publishers, independent authors, well, I mean, I guess all authors are independent in some way. But when I think about independent publishing, that's why it's a combination of those things. Is what is your vision, and how do you make a living out of it, if you want to take it to those terms? But even how do you interact with the people who are consuming the art that you create, and how many facilitators and layers are between you and your audience, if we want to put it that way? I think that is where the second level of independence comes up, because the more layers I have, the more facilitators, the more cooks in the kitchen, the more people with an opinion and a take on it. And that's when you have that design by committee and sand it out. It does not mean that as an individual creator, you can't be out there doing market research and figuring out what people like and what people don't like. It's not like you can't be understanding behavior to see how it matches with what you want to do. But how many opinions, and who's got the purse strings, and therefore who controls the final decision, becomes very diffused in a in a corporate ownership sort of model. And I think the same thing can happen at any scale, but that's the second level of independence, is that if I have a vision, that vision can come from other people. That vision can come from opinion and conversation. It doesn't only have to be born inside me, struck by lightning and, going eureka. But how many hoops do I have to jump through is often determined, or rather, to me, determines whether I'm truly independent or not. So they're slightly different.
Right.
There's that money aspect, and then there's the decision making or the speed of applying the decision making. When we talk about artists, we don't say an artist is a person who only wants to make money. We think of an artist as a person who first and foremost wants to make their art and would really like their art to make them money so that they don't have to do something else other than that art.
I also think it's important to say that art also can be made by committee. Denis Villeneuve's Dune, for example. I love his 2 Dune movies. I love it. And that's an enormous group of people working collaboratively to make a piece of art. So I think that's sometimes that gets lost in the conversation too, that, oh, well, because you say this, that means this. No. Art can still be made by a large group. And it's, especially within film, I think there's plenty of examples of very, very artistic visions, and I would also argue independent visions within some sort of structure that resembles some sort of corporate structure to some degree. Because again, when it comes to funding for independent films, you can think of like a Jodorowsky who's funding and working with producers that are interested in his vision. So they have access to a lot of money. They are funding him to a degree that allows him to create these pieces. He creates this art with a big group of people, whether that's cameramen, lighting technicians, actors, writers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, So I think it's important to say that you can still make really good art with a lot of people working on it together and people's hands in stuff and ideas coming from a group, And
I think in our context, people would say that about Marvel and DC as well. Yep. They'll say that, okay, there's some masterpieces in there and it was part of the system and it followed this method, but you still got a masterpiece, you still got a vision, and you may be even an auteur sort of vision in some cases, but it is collaborative at the very least between a writer, artist, and maybe a letterer, colorist. But then you've got the editorial teams, etc. What do you think of when we think about the barriers for reading? Again, it's a whole relative scale. So there'll be some people who will say, wow, you've really introduced me to comics I'd never heard of, like Usagi Yojimbo. And there'd be other people who'd say Usagi Yojimbo is a famous, renowned comic, and what's really independent is this John Porcellino. And then someone will say, John Porcellino has bound books from Drawn and Quarterly. He is an author who's not at all independent. What's really independent is this little zine I picked up at the festival last weekend over at that garage. So you can just keep going in grades and layers. I mean, I think you'll get to a Hollywood, Marvel, DC, Superman, Batman, Spider-Man sort of level, and that's your upper echelon as far as corporate mega IP ownership is concerned. But when boiling down to independent, it seems like the range or decision to label something as independent or not independent can just get more and more and more and more granular. So if you've got everything from Image Comics, where you've got The Walking Dead, making millions of dollars in some way, and then you've also got these zines. Like, how, when you think about independent comics, where is it that you're drawing the line? And over here, we can leave behind all of the corporate, etc. Like you mentioned, what's in your shop and what's not in your shop. Do you consider Fantagraphics an independent publisher, or Drawn and Quarterly? I mean, these are, as you were saying, big, renowned, world famous books all over the world get shipped, but again, there must be small print runs. Or would you say independent is even smaller?
So when I was really listening to music, one of the discussions that always kind of irritated me were these bickerings about genre labels. Well, that's not grindcore, that's gore grind, or that's this subgenre, or that's that subgenre. And I found those discussions, to be honest, always pretty boring, because ultimately, who cares? Do you like it or not? It's
Mhm.
not at that level for the independent stuff, because I do find it fascinating conversation, but I just honestly have never thought about any sort of like where my line is. And
Right.
that's come from just because I like so much different art that I don't put barriers up for myself. I do, you know, as much as I may shit talk Marvel and DC and superhero comics, sometimes I try not to. I don't make that a thing because that's not entertaining or interesting.
You cover Marvel and DC comics on your
Exactly
channel
right.
as
And I think that's the thing, right? Like, because I don't like putting those barriers. If I like art, I like art. And if I like a story, I like a story. Like, I'm
Sure.
looking at Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, I'm looking at All Star Superman, and I'm looking at Daredevil on a shelf here. And I love all of that stuff to such a degree, just like I love Richard Corbin, just like I like Francois Scoitin. So it's really putting up those kind of barriers for yourself, I don't think are helpful, because then I think that it starts you thinking of, well, can I like this? Because I've
Yeah.
really planted my flag in the world of independent or be damned. So therefore,
Yeah.
I now can't even consider a Marvel or DC comic because I've made it known that that stuff is evil, you know? So I do find that those limitations kind of stop you from just
No, fair
enjoying
enough.
art. And
I think I'll clarify a little bit then. What I meant to ask was, what is it that you would like to see more of in that way? Not so much about categorizing them into genres and saying, good, this is good and this is bad, but where I say, well, there's plenty of this. I'd like to see more of that.
right,
Somewhere there's a boundary, whether it's in numbers, whether it's in distribution, whether it's in number of projects being adopted, because one thing that I've noticed recently is the growth of genre oriented publishing, is that people going after horror, people going after sports, or
mm,
people going after noir or crime thriller, etc. And they're really giving people what people want. And in some ways it's nice, it's finessed, and it's becoming more specific. And then in some other cases I feel, well, isn't this just more formula after a while, in which you don't
right.
really explore something else? So I always end up saying, well, I think we've seen enough of those, because now it's becoming formula. Now it's becoming, and that's where I think about independent as being what's really important about independent publishing. What's really important, apart from the snobbery of saying, oh, you can read Marvel, I read independent comics, something like that.
Yeah, right.
Apart from the snobbery,
Right.
apart from the planting of the flag, um,
Yep.
independent always seems to me as a thing that needs to be nurtured, as a thing that needs to be watered, because there's not enough of it. Because once there is enough of it, then it kind of joins the other category. So my only reasoning or behind asking for that line was to say, what would you like to see more of, or paid more attention to, where we are today in comics publishing?
For me, what I would love to see more of is I would love to see more individuals creating comics and then having a better structure in place for distribution of those. I look at a place like Domino Books that's doing fantastic work with getting people out there. Ryan Carey recently started his Four Color Apocalypse publishing. He's got one title now. Colin Blanchett has been doing his Canon fanzine. So people that we kind of know from our YouTube world as well. I would love to see more creators, individuals creating more work and a better way of distribution for that. One of the things, and maybe you can relate to this as well, living in Canada, even though we just share a border, it is so kind of difficult to get some of that stuff here in Canada. You really have to put the time, and more importantly, you have to put the money in just to get these books across the border to come to you. And it's not, digital isn't the answer, because we all love the physical. Because I think of, again, going back to music, they've been able to bridge some of that stuff by things like Bandcamp. You can have the streaming and you can listen to the album. You can also purchase a tape or a CD or a record, whatever they decide to produce,
Hmm.
from these independent people. I would love to see something for these independent artists where there's more of a structured system, that it makes it easier to get their work to various places in North America or across the world, whatever that happens to be, right? That's something that I really, really want. And what I think places like Drawn and Quarterly and Fantagraphics were able to do back in the day when they started is they were able to generate, not only they had an amazing roster of artists and writers working for them, they also had a structure where they were able to get those books out to comic shops. I mean, I remember fondly in the early 90s going to my comic shops and finding Fantagraphics and Drawn and Quarterly stuff on the racks, some of them behind the counter in a box that you had to ask for, but some of them on the racks, you know. And I think that for these very, very, very small press people would be outstanding to get their work out in front of a larger audience so they can gain a little bit more of that mainstream success and maybe generate a little more income so they can create even more. You know, there's some creators, I mentioned David Enos earlier. He's easily one of my favorite of these kind of self-publishing guys. His work is incredible. I would love to see him produce something on like a monthly basis, but he's got a job, he's got a family, he's got a new baby. He's not making a boatload of money off of his books, I guess, to be able to kind of do that. So that would be something, I guess, to answer your question.
This is one of those circular problems because the distribution is one thing, but you've got to have something to feed the distribution. So if you get, say, distribution into 50 cities, now you're going to need 50 boxes of comics. That means you have to produce that many with no guarantees that you're ever going to sell any of them. So that distribution is so fueled by your print run and by the quantity you put in there. And you work those economies of scale by having a slightly lower unit cost because you've done this, and then making your margin after the distributor discount. And to be able to play that with a print run of 100 copies or 500 copies or even 5,000 copies, honestly.
It's not easy. It is feasible. There's guys like Reptile House, they do it. Domino does it as well too for small amounts. Like even if you want to pick up 10 issues of 10 copies of something, they'll do a kind of distro rate and knock some money off. But I think the biggest part of the equation is audience, you know, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, not anyone, but it's possible that we could all scrape together money and bring out 5,000 copies of some issue, you know, but then what? Oh, that's all our money into those 5,000 copies. And if we don't sell them, there's definitely not going to be an issue too, because the only money that you can make is the one that you get from that. So there is that aspect of it. And then there is obviously the fragility. I think the singles, the floppies, the local, the direct market, as well as the newsstand sort of thing in North America is one thing. But once you step away from that, it's a fragile item that can very easily get, you know, destroyed or damaged. And so therefore it doesn't really travel. And then once you start getting trade paperbacks and bound volumes, they start traveling much better. And not only do they make it into Barnes and Nobles and Books A Million and those sort of bookstores, but they also make it into other countries. And so therefore, I've often had this conversation where I wonder, in today's world with paper costs the way they are and the price of a floppy, is there a future in that sort of thinner, smaller, pamphlet-sized material? Or would it be, if it is to survive like vinyl and thrive on a niche market that grows every year, would it then need to be, no, it's got to be that hardcover with the cloth spine and the ribbon. That's the one.
Yeah, right.
That's going to be the thing. So that's a question I have, is that are we thinking about comics the way that they used to be? And I agree with you. I'm a physical comics person myself, but I honestly think that the new reading generations might be digital, and there's a whole different kind of monetization question there. But independent publishers might find their audience digitally because it doesn't have those restrictions of physical. It doesn't have the same constraints and allows things. But having said that, at the same time, I look at the growth of manga, not just in North America, but even in a market like India. And I see this sort of increasing market for a physical black and white comic, and it gives me hope. This is kind of counter to everything. So I don't know what my point is. I think there are a couple of contradictory things in here, but I've wondered about independent comics publishing being sort of limited by the very nature of its independence, if you know what I mean.
Right.
If I was making a big
Right.
boom explosion mainstream thing, I can take a risk on 5,000 copies because it's a big mainstream thing. But I've worked on something so idiosyncratic and so maybe transgressive and boundary pushing that I know that it's limited already, and so therefore I
Yep.
can't exploit the same distribution systems. So then where does that leave us? To me, it seems that it's not just the distribution, but the targeted like marketing, like finding your readers. Like
Yep.
you need 10,000 readers, you need 10,000 super fans, and they may be scattered all over the world. So how are you going to get your hands on them? Because
or even just adventurous readers. And again, I think this comes full circle to one of the main reasons I keep doing my channel is I feel that there's just not, there is some, I'm not saying there isn't any, but I personally don't feel that there's enough people who are adventurous with their reading. Again, keeping it just to comics.
Yeah.
I feel like there's such a big market that are just really stuck in whatever it happens to be that they're interested in. And again, I absolutely understand why that may be. I just find that unfortunate. And it's kind of the one of the main drives to keep doing the videos that I do and talk about, because again, I'm just talking about the things that I'm reading. I'm not specifically going to get stuff so I have stuff to talk about. This is just books that I'm reading during the week. Like I read Usagi Yojimbo this week and I read ComicKkrakK this week. You know what I mean? It's just, that's what I've read. But I think that that's a big drive for me to kind of continue with the channel is I want to put some of these creators and some of these comics in front of people. Even if that is only 100 people that watch my videos, that's 100 more people now that potentially know about a comic or a creator or something that maybe they didn't know about before, right? To try to build that interest and to try to get these names and creators out there, I think is huge to help people open up to something that maybe it just wouldn't have crossed their radar in any other way, because it's just not within their wheelhouse of looking online for comics or going to their shops or whatever happens to be. And it's the same with the back issues too, like exploring the 50-cent bins and dollar bins and, hey, look what I found for 50 cents that came out in 1986. This is incredible. And I always see these out there. You know, it's that idea of that exploration and opening yourself up to a variety of different things instead of just staying in your lane, you know, because I'm a Marvel DC fan, so therefore I only read these or whatever it happened, or a FantaGraphics fan, so all I read is FantaGraphics, right? It can happen on.
You know, there are those people out there. I only read FantaGraphics.
Yeah, that's right. And they do this a lot and they talk about, you know, I should
get used to that. There is this idea that independent publishing, and particularly independent comics, and I think particularly the kind of self-published almost independent comics in North America that you're referring to, they are incredibly localized. You know, you've got the LA scene being given, or the New York City life, you know, or Portland, Oregon. And while there are things that are universal, the mainstream comics, or the ones that even achieve mainstream success, I'm thinking about how Canadian Scott Pilgrim is, and that doesn't have any barriers to it being popular and successful all over the world. And at the same time, it's got all these very peculiar references in there, but it's accessible in a way that something similar, but just not that smooth, would not be accessible. So if independent work is localized to a certain extent, how much is distribution actually going to help if it's not something someone in New Delhi is going to automatically understand what this is about or what this is, you know, which is not to say that it can't happen with anything else. And I think there is obviously in all of literature, there's a level of specificity that still makes it universal. But it almost seems like the underground comics and the counterculture comics, these ones require being sort of soaked in what they're talking about. And if I'm going to read Zap comics or something, I actually have to put myself into a mindset and maybe even do a little bit of research or figure out what's going on. Do you think I'm wrong about that? That level of localization might sometimes mean that they are as big as they can be because that's who they're talking to? Or am I sort of being short-sighted in a little
Possibly,
bit?
but I think of like, there's a couple of things I think of when you say that. Number one is when you're reading underground comics, I think the context of the time is crucial
Mm-hmm.
to kind of having a bigger appreciation of underground comics. I personally don't think that you can take those separately. Now, within underground comics, I believe that there's a number of titles that you don't necessarily have to have that idea at the forefront of your mind. It can be buried somewhere in the back because you can still enjoy a creative comic and have a very, very rudimentary understanding of what it was that they were doing at that time with underground comics. I think like when you, again, going back to music, if you are steeped in the history of jazz, you're going to get a different appreciation of maybe some modern jazz players that are referencing some older stuff.
Right.
But it's finding that balance of what's a good jazz album that can be a wide appeal to a lot of people, but then there's gonna be these Easter eggs for like the hardcore fans, you know, that are really going to do some throwbacks. So it comes down to storytelling. And as far as like the localized, I think the localized thing just does well for creating a scene. I mean, currently there's a big New York scene with Floyd Tangeman and people. And again, spearheaded by Domino Comics, another plug for Domino Comics. The idea that there's a scene going on there, but they're sort of referencing some underground stuff. They're very much creating their own thing. And because there's a bunch of them, that scene can kind of now get a bigger exposure. So now for a guy like me who's addicted to that stuff, now I only need to go to one place to get a bunch of different artists and see some comics, as opposed to a bunch of different places. And again, I think some of this comes down to just fundamental storytelling, that if you're going to make something so niche that you have to have lived pretty much the same life that I had, I would argue that's not a good story. Because part of storytelling is getting an idea or an experience across to a reader. I don't think that when it comes to storytelling specifically, I don't think that you can just tell stories and not consider an audience ever. I think that you do have to consider, like with any sort of communication, what am I trying to communicate? How can I best communicate it to an audience? When it comes to the artistry of that, the cartoonist or the person drawing it, whether they're the same people or not, I think that's when you can kind of take a step back from that and go, well, I have my style and I'm going to kind of do my style and audience be damned, you know? So it's a weird sort of dichotomy with how you're communicating versus your audience, you know?
You gave me that light bulb moment. Niche is that thing on the spectrum with mainstream. So it's independent versus corporate on this axis, and mainstream versus niche. So you can have something that is corporate and niche, and you can have something that is independent and mainstream. And a lot of these questions that have to do with distribution, they fall somewhere in the middle, because if you made something mainstream, you'd still have to deal with the distribution problem, but the distribution problem is also based on how mainstream did you make something. And so therefore, what kind of a print run are you willing to gamble on, and what kind of an investment are you willing to make on sales that you don't know whether they'll come or not? Independent, I think, is automatically classified as niche. And that might be for a good reason. And that might be because when you have a niche thing to say, or you have a niche expression, the only way you can do it is through independent publishing, because the corporate publishing is interested in mainstream. So that's the way it turns out. But it doesn't have to be. And I think what we're talking about is independent publishing, which is driven by independent visions. Even if they're made by committee, even if they're made by a group of people, they're sort of unified by a vision, not in a corporate structure with people second guessing and changing budgets and, you know, censoring what can and cannot be there because of advertisers. Without that, you can have something be mainstream that's independent. And the problems that we would want to solve would have to do with the mechanics of things, not with their funding, if you see what I mean. Because I completely agree with you. I don't think saying niche and independent are equal is the right thing. I think there can be overlaps, but there can also not be. And so therefore, when we think about independent publishing, what I think of is that's where you're going to get new stuff from. I think
Yes.
the larger machines will finesse it and smoothen it and make it widely known and probably reap most of the financial benefits from it. We talked right at the beginning a little bit about crowdfunding, which I agree with you. It seems to me like a sort of revolutionary. I mean, I don't know if I'm being naive, but it seems like a completely different way of approaching things in which you make your sale to the customer first and then use that money in order to do the production of the item. Are there things like that? This other thing that you mentioned, this kind of collective of creating an area in which multiple small pieces can all be gathered together, and then for the reader, here is one place in which you get everything. So like crowdfunding, it seems like if you don't have the big numbers, you put multiple small things together to make a big number. Are there other things like that that you're seeing as being the way independent publishing should go, or what they can lean on? Is there something that you're particularly positive on?
I mean, I'm generally positive about all of that stuff because, again, there's just this, there seems to be this growth of voices that kind of again, going back to Ryan Carey, he's been around for a long time. He's written for Comics Journal. He's written on his own blog, Four Color Apocalypse, getting his hand into now publishing. He now has that audience where now it's, hey, this is what I'm getting my voice behind and finances behind in order to bring this to you, people who have been listening to me or friends with me or reading me for all these years. I think that's the stuff I see as positive. People that are within kind of the fandom side who aren't necessarily creators themselves, building these smaller platforms. And again, we're talking on the scale of things, very small platforms, but a platform nonetheless, where now they're able to kind of bring some of these people forward to that audience. And I find that very encouraging because I also find that when I'm reading some of these new creators, when they're younger people, they're like in their early 20s and they're producing some incredible work. So it's this, I do see that there's this new generation of people that are creating comics that are very much their own. Yes, of course, I don't think you can ever fully get away from influence, whether that influence comes from comics or movies or wherever you're drawing it from. I do feel like there's a lineage that you can trace, but it's really encouraging to see so many new voices. We're fortunate enough here in town to have a place, Fantasy Club Books, and he's a very, very, very small comic shop. He's part of a bigger store. He's got like the back corner, but some of the stuff that he's able to bring in is incredible from all sorts of creators, both Canadian and American. And he's also trying to get people locally who have never thought about doing comics. He's been doing courses where it's like, come and spend the afternoon and we'll talk about creating a comic and I'll take you through creating it. And you can, in this afternoon, you can create your own comic yourself, with the intention of he wants to put that stuff on the shelves and kind of promote local talent and things. So I do see that there's a new generation of people that are excited about it in a different way than I feel like I've seen for quite a while.
Really?
Because it's now really more in the hands of individuals. They're not even, some of them are for sure parts of kind of smaller publishers and things, but there's so many people now out there that, again, this technology has gotten easier and easier. They can lay stuff out on their computer. There's a variety of print shops. I mean, we saw this risograph explosion a number of years ago where everybody was doing risographed comics. So there's more avenues out there for them to get stuff printed and published in these very unique ways. They don't just have to rely on a Xerox machine. So I do feel like there's a bit of a resurgence with some of that independence. Yeah, I feel like there's a bit of a resurgence there for sure, that there's a new generation of people that are approaching comics in their own way and not always necessarily from, we need to continue a voice from this earlier era and we're doing the modern thing. They're kind of doing their own thing.
And what about the readers then? Because then we've got creators and we've got creators who are becoming publishers. We've got co-op and conglomeration. We can even look at crowdfunding. But where are the new readers going to come from? Because we know where the new readers of the big business corporate stuff is going to come from. And over here, I don't mean to be disparaging. If I think about the success of Raina Telgemayer's comics or Dave
Hmm.
Pilkey's comics, they're Scholastic, and this is like the biggest comics publisher in some ways in the world, is Scholastic
Absolutely.
right now. But I mean, it gets new readers and it gets people in, and these are good comics too, I feel. But what about the independents, the underground, or the alternative, the different vocabulary that's been used over there? Where's does that readership come from? Where does the next generation of that readership come from, do you think?
And that's one that I don't know if I know an answer to, because that then leads me to think of like, are there people out there that are pushing boundaries, that are questioning things in just general everyday life? Like the rise of undergrounds in the 60s, you had a very politicized movement of hippies and campuses that were having protests, and all sorts of things culturally were happening, where I feel that was a fertile group of people that were looking very clearly to establish themselves as, we are not like our parents. We're not like other
Mhm.
generations. We are very, very vocally creating our line in the sand. And doing so, there's all sorts of films, there's all sorts of music, there's all sorts of art, there's comics, there's all these things that they really took control of. Part of that was carving out their own identity. And I just don't know. And this may be because I'm older and I'm not as in tune with it. I'm always willing to accept that as an answer. But I just don't know if that's something that I see happening, where a large group of people are looking to really entrench themselves and carve out their own identity. And
Hmm.
especially, unfortunately, I just don't see a lot of people that are willing to push boundaries on things, that are willing to talk about things. Again, a big part of the appeal for me personally with underground comics was this idea of just putting your id out on the page. And yes, of course, though, that can create some stuff that's very boring, but I think it can also create some stuff that is really engaging, of like, this is an individual that's struggling with that, whatever concepts and ideas, some of them quote unquote offensive and
Right.
otherwise. And I just don't know if that audience is as big these days as it was back then. And I just don't know if I see that corner turning anytime. And I think ultimately with any of this stuff, it comes down to an audience. Is there an audience that is interested in hearing those kind of ideas? And it could very well be, again, the old man in me speaking, that maybe they're just not interested in those ideas because they're exploring other areas that are subversive, that aren't kind of in this world. And it's just my viewpoint that's maybe skewed. Where an
I
audience
mean,
comes from for anything is a mystery to me. And that goes for whatever we're talking about.
well, unlike you, I refuse to say that me being old is maybe
Yeah.
one of the reasons. I won't say
Right.
that, but I do think that I may have perhaps a more generous attitude towards the younger generations, which I see in some ways as being more socially aware and
Right.
kind and empathetic than I think things were even when I was younger, and definitely when
Mhm.
my parents and grandparents. I mean, I think there is a change in the social fabric, but maybe it's an urban thing, maybe it's an elite thing, maybe it's not as widespread as I would like to think of it. But another thing did occur to me is that I've been waiting all my life for comics to become a big thing, like to become a big
Yeah.
thing the way that video games became a big thing in my lifetime. Now Dungeons and Dragons has become a huge thing. So,
Huge.
yeah. And I'm just like, and how come comics? I mean, sure, Marvel and DC movies, I guess some of these are related. So the characters might have become big and the IP might have become big from the merchandising point of view. But the medium of comics, I've always felt like this is the big medium. This has got everything. So, like, why isn't this bigger? And now I'm wondering if that time has passed. Now, I'll caveat that by saying maybe only from that point of view of that physical bound or stapled thing, the
Mhm.
underground or the independent stuff that we're talking about. This was honestly a cheaper way than the media that was controlled by corporations. This was a
Yes.
cheaper form of distribution, a cheaper form of expression. You didn't need a studio, you didn't need 50 people or 100 people, things like that. And that may not be the case anymore. It may not be cheaper, and it'll cost you $6 for a floppy, and that floppy has a huge print run behind it. But also, do you think that people have social media now? They have electronic media and digital audio and video, which for the kind of things you're talking about, where I've seen the pushback against, say, a majoritarian approach in government happening, but not in comics per se, the way that we would have thought, say, 20 or 30 years ago that they might be in comics, but it's somewhere else. And comics is going to be, I don't know, maybe a medium for self-expression in autobiography. I've seen a lot of comics being made these days by people who talk about their mental health issues or their neurodivergence. And that's something that, I haven't seen before, and now I see more and more. So my curiosity is like, maybe it won't be that, but maybe it'll be something completely different that we people who are not that old just don't see coming, because we're not expecting that. I don't know what you think about that.
I mean, I think you've nailed it. I think that one of the crucial things to think about with any of these conversations is in the 60s and 70s, how you were getting these ideas across, whether even if it was like a fanzine to talk. I mean, I remember growing up in the 80s and 90s with this publisher called AK Press. And AK Press had things like the Anarchist Cookbook, and they had these very political kind of authors that were talking about things that were going on in the world. And that's how you found out about that stuff. Nowadays, you can find out about that stuff through the internet, through social media, through YouTube, where it's not as reliant on, I need to give you this pamphlet so you can read it and find this information. Now I can send you this link and you can listen to a guy talk for 36 hours on his podcast about the whole history of whatever, right? Like it's just a different mode of communicating some of those maybe transgressive ideas. So I agree with you in that. I think that is what happens with kind of when you're, as I'm noticing myself as I'm getting older and kind of dealing with the concept of time and seeing it differently, there is a tendency to kind of be stuck in one area of, well, that's the way you communicate, when it's like, well, no, it's not. Not that I'm explicitly thinking that, but I think that some of that is built in, right? Where it's now there's different ways of communicating, there's different ways of storytelling. It's one of the things that I think about when we see the kind of progress of AI when it comes to filmmaking and people talking about that's the end of Hollywood. First of all, I don't believe that. But second of all, one of the things that I would say is that any art form is going to change. And why would you ever think that one form of storytelling is going to be the way that it is for hundreds and thousands of years? It could end and there could be something else. And the movies in general, the way that we know them, they very well could be over. Again, I don't personally think that, but I could see that being an argument that why is it that form of storytelling is going to be something that's going to exist forever? Why would you possibly think that? So I think the same with comics, that yes, we love them and we're surrounded by them and we eat, sleep, and breathe them. I literally dream about them sometimes. Why is it that is going to be the way it's always going to be? And I think that that's a big part of the conversation that I think people don't necessarily talk about to the degree that I think is necessary, that this form of storytelling may be over. Again, I don't believe that, but it may very well be, right? That it's going to morph into something different that we just don't have a concept of right now in 2024. That's 2 years down the line, maybe things dramatically change.
At the same time, people have been bemoaning the death of something or the other all the time.
Forever,
so
Right.
People would have said that Hollywood filmmaking ended, when the 7th Fast and Furious movie came out or something like that. So it doesn't mean that independent comics are going anywhere.
Right.
But independent comics, independent stuff by the very definition will always exist, because there'll always be a alternative. There's never going to be a monolithic, homogeneous. We can fear monopolies, but it can never be an absolute. only one thing. There will always be something or the other. What we like it to be is we'd like to be a thriving community rather than an absolutely on the fringes, just a couple of, people working at it. We'd want it to be a good counterbalance. But the way I look at it, and I think the way that we've been discussing it, is there are so many different factors in it, including the creators and the finances and what kind of control who has. But it does essentially come down, I completely agree with you, it essentially comes down to a certain kind of bravery on the part of the reader. Take a risk and develop your taste and develop your likes and dislikes. I don't think everyone has equal access to that level of range or what they see. But the last thing that I think, and this is why I want to make it the last thing, because I know us and we could go on. What's your thoughts on the government? What about the government? What are the government? What's the government doing?
This right here is my thoughts on the government right here.
Right.
I only speak the language of T-shirts and comic books. I mean, just to kind of touch back 1 second on what you were just saying is, I think for me, ultimately, what it comes down to, and I think it ties in with the government question as well, too. What it ties into for me is I personally, as just a human being on this planet, I sometimes am concerned with, I worry that there's not enough independent voices. And I worry when we talk independent comics and people creating stuff and people speaking their own truth, whatever it happens to be, I sometimes worry that there's just not enough of it. And again, I completely understand that maybe it's happening in other areas that I'm just not tuned into. I'm open to that, but I just do worry that there isn't enough independent thought. And I think that for me translates into my feelings these days about government and political parties. One of the things that I've done on my channel recently is I will talk occasionally about politics. I don't make it a huge part.
Yeah, I did want to mention that because I don't think that's a thing many people would do. And I don't think you do it obtrusively or offensively. But the fact that you do it and you do it honestly is a remarkable aberration in general. I don't think your channel is only a comics channel. You do talk about music, you talk about a number of other things, but it tends to be focused on that. But you've never shied away from the political commentary about a number of things. And again, we won't get into here, but I've enjoyed your conversations on labor, for example, on which you've talked about a number of times. I do admire that. But anyway, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's totally fine. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I mean, because I did worry about it at first, and that's why when I do talk about it, I feel myself even now getting a little uncomfortable, because I know that sometimes when it comes to these discussions, I fully understand that there can be a real hotbed of really aggressive one side or the other, depending on your viewpoint. It can really create some tension. And I never want to do that with my channel. But on the flip side, there are things that I think about during the day. I don't just, as much as I do think about comics and things, I also think about a lot of other things. I worked at our union. I was the steward there for 6 years. So I dealt with contract negotiations. I dealt with member issues. I dealt with HR issues. I see the state of unions. Again, speaking North America, I do see the state of unionization and unions in North America as something that's a big concern to me, that I feel we're moving away, even when I look at my own local and my own union. So I do feel that some of that, and again, I think it really ties in with a lot of the comics that I do speak about, because a lot of people out there, they say it, not me. I often get talked about as like the king of the underground comics on YouTube. You know what I mean? Like the guy who talks about them the most. So I do feel that that is part of my identity. And one of the things within those underground comics was a very political and activist kind of mentality. In the 60s, they're talking about nature and the importance of organizations that turned out later to be called Greenpeace and things. And they're talking about corporate greed, and they're talking about all of these things that are unfortunately still very much alive in our current time. And we're 60 years on from that,
Yeah.
So I do feel it's important to talk about those things, but I am also very aware that for the most part, people come to listen about comics and things and entertainment. But since it is a vlog, if these things are in my mind, I don't shy away from them. and I usually talk about them at the beginning of the chat. So it's a chance for, if people don't want to listen, just skip the video ahead a half an hour and then you can get into the rest of it. Yeah. But I do feel it's important to have discussions, because one of the things that also concerns me is, we touched on it in this conversation too, these one versus the other. I think there's far too many conversations politically where it's us versus them. And if you don't believe what I do, then you are the enemy. And I feel like that just doesn't do that does us all a disservice. We need to be thinking about things from the point of view of almost like a class struggle, like the employers versus employees to some degree, or labor versus management. And I use that term versus very loosely. I don't literally mean like we need to fight, although sometimes I do mean that. But I do feel like there's conversations that are happening politically that do then translate into comics. I mean, we see the rise of things like ComicsGate over the past number of years, and this really hardline thinking about comics are only this thing, and any sort of ideas that come into my comics that are woke or whatever, we need to completely abandon and fight against. And I just feel that we do ourselves a disservice. And I do see it in comics, which is also why I feel that it's important to talk about on a comics channel about how I feel about those things. Because I think labeling anybody is complete nonsense. Affiliating yourself completely with one side of whatever political spectrum, I think you do yourself a disservice. Just like I do if I think you only read DC comics. I think you do yourself a disservice. If you only listen to pop music, you do yourself a disservice. There's so much fantastic art. There's so many fantastic ideas out there, whether that's within art, whether that's within movies or music, and that all translates to political thinking, to my mind. All of this it's hard to separate all of them. How you view some of these artistic movements and ideas ultimately come down to your politics as a person. And I think as human beings, we need to be open to listening to everybody. Not saying you have to go and listen to that 36-hour podcast, but we do have to be open to the ability to listen to ideas and learn to communicate to each other, no matter where we're kind of coming from, which is why it's important for me to talk about Marvel and DC in the videos, because A, I like some of the books quite a bit, and B, why would I not talk about them? What would be the point of that? What am I trying to say by excluding stuff? That's not a message that I get behind.
I think that's very well said. What do you think should be, or should there be, a role of the government in things like independent publishing, in things like the independent creative arts? And over here, I'm not talking only about funding to academic institutions, which of course is a thing, but the businesses that are given the value seem to focus on a couple of things, on how many jobs are they going to create and what's the turnover going to be, etc. Is there something missing over there when it comes to the arts, when it comes to the business of the arts and the challenges that are faced? Or, I mean, I'm guessing that we would both kind of agree on this, but then what would you say to the people who will be like, no, that's not the government's job and this is not supposed to be that? Or is that too loaded a question for the last one of the evening?
No, I don't think it's too loaded. And I mean, it's a fairly easy one to some degree, from being from Canada, is our government has a big hand in helping fund the arts. Like the National Film Board is the first thing that comes to mind, Canadian, right, and partially funded by the government. In our own province here, we work hand in hand with the film community because they offer incentives for these productions coming into the province. So that's having a hand in creating art. I do feel like it makes it a little easier for some of these things to exist because we have the backing of the government. On the flip side, of course, there's the conversation of the government is now involved in the arts, which means that they're going to have a say in what you can create artistically. Right. I personally haven't seen that. I'm not saying that it never happens. I just personally don't have any stories about that, but I could absolutely see that as a concern. People have that concern here in Canada when it comes to the CBC, which is our news organization, being funded fully by the government. Therefore, they're not going to talk about things or be critical of the government in the same way as an independent news media might be, because they don't rely on that government funding, which then leads us back to our conversation at the beginning about mainstream working for a corporation where you're going to to not have the ability to talk freely about some things because there's this hand in there. So it kind of bridges both the politics and the art that we're talking about. Do I feel like our governments in general need an overhaul? 100% I do. I feel like we're at a real turning point as human beings where I don't have the answers as someone sitting in his basement here in Winnipeg, but I do know that I see that we need a change. And I see that we need a different relationship with governments in general. But again, 100% what that is, I don't know if I have the answers to that. I just know that there's a lot of struggles out there that I do feel like aren't getting better by our government's involvement and our political system as it currently exists. And again, talking as a Canadian here, obviously I'm not speaking for the rest of the world, so yeah, there's my shortish answer about that stuff.
Thank you, because that's one of the things that I think about. And while you have the experience you have with the unions, with the film industry, etc., what I've seen in publishing and what I've seen not just with my work but around me, the numbers games are going to only skew in the direction of a couple of things. And to me, at a very basic level, it doesn't make sense to make the numbers game the absolute primary be all and end all of things, because then you're going to end up with just the few handful of things. Now, I'm not even talking about monopolistic companies. I'm talking about products. You'll only have one type of movie. You'll only have one type of book, because that's what the numbers would support. And it's the independent publishers that I think keep making counter cases, because they fill the gaps that this kind of broad strokes sort of approach leaves. And by filling the gaps and by consolidating all the gaps, you create another number. And then that number, it's not going to compete with that big number, but it's going to look nice. It's going to look like a decent number. And then people are like, oh, that's the number we're leaving on the table. And so then they create this interest in that area. So even from a purely capitalistic, mercenary point of view, I see that as being that sort of mechanism that keeps identifying what a mainstream approach or a bland big numbers approach will always ignore. I do hope that the kind of independent publishing that we have been talking about, that sort of non-beholden to corporate and multi-leveled interests and sort of visionary approach to the content, while still being a business thing that still could be mainstream, is a vitally important thing. But I think in conclusion, I'm not sure if either of us are sure of what's going to come next. We've got some hopes and we've got some fears, but I think it's a conversation worth continuing. I'd love to see you feature more of the kind of independent works that you do, but also creators maybe on your channel, people who are facing these challenges. And I think that specific kind of story might be inspirational and very illuminating to people, because that's certainly what I think of when I think of your channel. I think about this maverick independent vlog in which there's this one guy who's in charge of it all, and there are a number of different things that interest them, and they can bring it all together and deliver it through a force of personality. It's a unique thing. It doesn't matter whatever failings or shortcomings we see and these kind of things when we look too close. There's nobody else like that, and it's not replicated. And that's what the independent thing is supposed to be all about. It's not cookie cutter. It's not a template.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, I would agree with that. It's not. And I think the importance of talking about those things, one of the things that I'll kind of leave you with, I guess, is a guy on YouTube, Peter Boghossian. Not an enormous fan of the guy and everything he says, but one of the things that he does say that I absolutely agree with is, you touched on it yourself, that this idea of, if I present an idea, that means that idea is now associated with me as a human being. And I think we need to move away from some of that association and be able to have conversations about ideas. And I think that's the beauty sometimes with these comics, where not everything that you're reading from these independent creators are necessarily how they see the world. I think it's also important to think of them as they don't necessarily have ownership of the idea. Let's just talk about this as an idea or a concept. Let's look at this idea and let things come forward from us in discussing that we don't have to worry about now being associated with that idea when we're just discussing things. And I think that's crucial to all of the conversations we've had today about separating yourself a little bit from your ideas and the ability to discuss things openly without the fear of being judged as a good or a bad person based on an idea that's come out of your mouth. It's kind of this just reflexive, let's talk about it in depth and discuss it from all different angles. So yeah. And I mean, ultimately, I will also say that I appreciate you asking me to come on the channel. Like, I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's not where I thought it was going to go, but that's fantastic. I love that about, again, it's the beauty of doing these kind of off the cuff discussions. It goes all sorts of directions, and this one was fantastic. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It was a great pleasure having you here, Terence. And I think this conversation, yes, I wasn't expecting this either, but we've known each other for a while online. I've always enjoyed the way that you talk about things and the sincerity that you bring with it. So I feel wherever the conversation went is a general reaction to your genuineness and to your passion. So thank you so much for sharing that with me. And I look forward to our next conversation on whatever topic it is. I'm sure it'll be extremely interesting. But just before we sign off, why don't you let the viewers know where you can be found and what they can expect from you on your channel?
So ComicKkrakK is the name of the channel, and it's KKRAKK. And it's you can expect all sorts of things on there, but mainly comics. Like, it's really, my channel has really developed into pretty, for the most part, 1 or 2 videos a week. Generally Sundays, I like to do a Sunday wrap where I talk about things that have been on my mind during the week. And like we talked about, sometimes politics gets in there, but for the most part, it's about what I've been reading, maybe what I've been listening to. And again, I think the main drive is I just want to put people in touch with creators that they might not know. I do understand you and Earl Grey talked about it a bit in your video too, this idea of there's kind of a trap that sometimes you can get where it almost creates this FOMO from people and this, hey, look what I have that you don't. I really, really try not to do that. I understand that sometimes that does come through because I'm a nerd and I get excited about things. So some of that comes through in the video. But for the most part, I genuinely just want to bring comics and creators to an audience that might not know about them. I feel that there's some incredible voices out there from the 60s, 70s, 80s, all the way into today that I just don't think get a lot of exposure on YouTube. And I really strive to make sure that I'm doing them justice when I talk about them and show their books and things. You can also find me on Twitter. I'm not very active there, to be honest. I do check in every once in a while. But as far as any other social media, I'm really not. I'm on Instagram, but I'm not really engaged with it as much as I used to be. YouTube is the place to have the conversations and come and check out what I think about the world and think about comics. Yeah,
absolutely. YouTube is the place for us. And I will just second what ComicKkrakK, what Terence just said, because I think you do a fantastic job spotlighting things that I would certainly not have run across. There is that level of irateness I feel where I can't get my hands on it. So that is a FOMO in a different way. But I honestly think that is one of the things I think about as YouTube, putting things in front of me that I wouldn't otherwise be able to see, but also that DIY punk garage band aesthetic of doing it all yourself and sort of just picking up a guitar and playing. That's what I associate with your channel, which is just a fantastic little treasure on YouTube. Terence, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being on, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, anytime. I'm always around.